There was one evening in the second week of finals where it all briefly boiled over. Eli had been up since 5 in the morning and had hit a wall around 9 at night, and Zach, who had been restless all day, kept offering solutions that Eli didn't need. Study a different subject, take a break, go for a walk. Just stop for an hour until Eli finally put his pen down with slightly more force than intended and said, "I don't need you to fix it. I need you to be quiet." It came out sharper than he meant it. Zach went quiet, not angry, more stung, more pulled inward. He stood up, said he was going to get some air, and left. He was outside for 20 minutes. Eli, who had immediately felt the sharpness of his own words, sent a text after 10. "I'm sorry. That was unkind." Zach read it on the bench outside the building. He sat with it. Then he went back inside and sat down and said, "I know you didn't mean it like that. I also know I was pushing too hard." Eli said, "I get like that during finals." "I should have told you," Zach said. "I get like that all the time. I should have read the room." Pause. Eli picked up his pen. Zach opened his laptop. After a moment, Eli said, "Thank you for coming back." Zach said, "I was always going to come back." He said it simply, without drama. He meant it completely. Finals ended. They survived. The last week of the semester, before everyone dispersed for summer, there was a kind of exhale across campus that could be felt in every space. People laughing too freely. Music from open windows, the particular relief of something finished. Zach and Eli were at their cafe table on Wednesday morning, end-of-term light coming through the windows. Eli had his book, but it was closed. He was just sitting there, drinking his tea. Zach was watching him in the specific way he'd developed over the past 8 months, not staring, just noticing. Presence as its own kind of statement. Eli said without looking up, "You're doing the thing," Zach said. "What thing?" Eli said, "The watching thing." Zach said, "I'm not watching." Eli said, Zach said, "Fine, I'm watching a little." Eli finally looked up. "What are you thinking?" Zach thought about it for a moment. Then he said, "I was thinking that I'm glad I took the wrong door." Eli was quiet for a moment. Then, very quietly, he said, "Me too." They sat there in the end-of-semester morning light, in the cafe they'd been meeting at for 8 months. With all of this behind them, the slow beginning, the trust building, the complications and misunderstandings, and moments of fear and moments of grace, and none of it resolved or explained or tied up neatly, because real things don't work like that. But all of it present and accounted for and survivable and good. Eli picked up his closed book and tapped it against the table once.
Out thoughtfully.
Then he said, "I want you to meet my family in person this summer." Zach looked at him. "Not a video call. Actually in person? They want to meet you," Zach said. "Your sister has more questions?" Eli said, "Alina has a list." "She texted me." Zach said, "Of course she did." He was smiling. Eli was smiling. The cafe was warm, and the semester was over, and everything ahead was uncertain in the specific and ordinary and completely manageable way that life is always uncertain. Zach said, "Yeah, I'd like that." Eli said, "Yeah." Zach said, "Yeah." He picked up his coffee. "We should probably talk about summer," he said. Eli said, "We should probably talk about a lot of things." Zach said, "That sounds terrifying." Eli said, "It does, doesn't it?" He opened his book. He found his place. The yellow highlighter appeared from somewhere. "Fortunately," he said, without looking up, "we're both relatively good at hard conversations by now." Zach thought about the supply closet he'd walked into in September. The reading event he'd shown up at uninvited. The voice note at midnight on New Year's Eve. The paper they'd rebuilt together. The hand on the April path. The argument during finals, the coming back. He thought about all of it, the whole 8 months of it, and he said, yeah, we kind of are. He leaned back in his chair. He looked at Eli, who was reading again, highlighter moving across a sentence worth keeping. Zach thought, I am not afraid. I am not waiting for something to go wrong. I am here, in this cafe, in this morning, with this person who is completely impossible and completely mine. He picked up the book he'd brought, the same one Eli had been reading the first day, the one he'd bought after Eli mentioned it, and finally actually read and found. To his genuine surprise, that he loved, he opened it to page 1. He started reading outside. The campus was full of the sound of a semester ending, and inside the cafe, 2 people sat together in easy silence, completely comfortable, completely present, completely okay. That was how it was, and how it stayed, and how imperfect and real and deeply, stubbornly good it began. Summer arrived the way it always does in late June, all at once, and then undeniably. Eli went home for 3 weeks before returning to the city for a summer research position he'd applied 2 months earlier, analyzing Victorian correspondence for a professor's upcoming book. Zach stayed and picked up extra shifts at the campus bookstore, which he'd been working at part-time since sophomore year and UCE, genuinely enjoyed in a way he'd never fully admitted to anyone who thought his personality, type, and bookstore work were incompatible. They video called every other night. The calls were long and meandering and comfortable. Eli sitting at his childhood desk with the window behind him, talking about what he was reading. Zach lying on his bed with a lamp on, occasionally getting up to show Eli something on the shelf. His youngest sister, Alina, had taken to appearing in the background of Eli's calls to deliver updates about her ongoing dog campaign and once to show Zach a drawing she'd made of what she imagined Zach's apartment looked like, which featured an impressive number of sports trophies and a dog that didn't exist. Zach told her the drawing was incredibly accurate. Alina beamed. Eli, watching, looked like someone who had long since made peace with the fact that his family was deeply chaotic and was choosing daily to find this charming. 3 weeks later, Eli came back. He had a small apartment near the university, summer sublet, 2 floors above a laundromat that smelled perpetually of clean linen. Zach helped him carry boxes up for flights of stairs and spent the first evening building a bookshelf incorrectly and then correctly and then deciding they'd gone right the first time actually. They ordered Thai food and ate it on the floor of a half-unpacked apartment, surrounded by boxes of books and a single lamp and the warm smell of June through an open window. Eli was reading the instructions for the lamp, which were unnecessary because the lamp was on. Zach was eating directly from the container. It was exactly ordinary. It was one of Zach's favorite evenings of his life. Eli's research position turned out to suit him perfectly quiet. Sitting with old letters in careful handwriting and figuring out what people had been trying to say to each other across enormous distances of time and space. He came home from the university archive in the evenings with his head full of Victorian observations and would sometimes say things like, there was a woman in 1887 who wrote to her friend every week for 40 years and kept every letter she received in chronological order with a kind of wonder in his voice that was entirely genuine. Zach found this almost unreasonably endearing. He told Marco this. Marco said, "You're the person now. You're the person in the stories people tell at weddings." Zach said, "Don't." Marco said, "The bookseller and the lit student. It practically writes itself." Zach said, "I work at a bookstore. That's not the same as Marco said. The bookseller and the lit student." Zach did not argue further because Marco was, objectively, correct. Meeting Eli's family in person was something Zach had been thinking about since the moment it was suggested. With a background hum of low-grade nerves that he didn't especially admit to, he had built them up in his head from months of context, Alina and her questions and her drawings, Mina and her quiet, considered observations, the parents who had sent Eli into the world as the specific, particular person he was, which meant they had done something significantly right. When the visit finally happened on a Saturday afternoon in early July, Eli's family drove up from their town, and they all went for a long lunch at a restaurant near the Wada that Eli had researched carefully and booked a week in advance. Alina was exactly as Zach had expected, which was to say, relentless, warm, loud in the best way. With a memory for detail that she deployed without mercy. She had, it turned out, kept a document. It was a Notes app document titled Questions for Eli's Person, and it contained 14 questions organized by category. Zach answered all 14, including the one about his feelings on Dog Strong Advocate. His most embarrassing school story, the supply closet, and whether he had ever cried at a book which he had once. At the ending of the book Eli had gotten him to read, and which produced from Alina an expression of absolute approval so total and serious it made Eli's mother laugh, Mina sat next to Zach at the table and said very little. But twice during lunch she pointed something out to him specifically. Once a seagull doing something funny near the window. Once a sentence in the menu she found grammatically suspicious, and each time Zach responded seriously, which seemed to be what she was looking for. By the end of lunch, she had shown him a playlist she was working on, which was an extremely high honor. Eli's parents were warm and genuine and asked about his studies and his plans, and with great care and without making it a thing about his relationship with his father, which they'd heard about in general terms and which Eli's father in particular seemed to want to understand. Not by asking about it directly, but by noting, at some point in the afternoon, that it was good that Eli had people in his life who showed up. He said it in a way that was clearly also directed at Zach, and Zach nodded. And something in his chest was grateful and quietly complicated in equal measure. Driving back from the restaurant, Eli in the passenger seat and Alina having fallen asleep in a way that suggested she had used every unit of energy available to her, Eli said very quietly, "Thank you." Zach said, "For what?" Eli said, "For being exactly yourself." Zach was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Your family is incredible." Eli said, "They really liked you." Zach said, "Mina showed me her playlist." Eli turned to look at him with an expression of genuine shock. "She showed you the playlist?" Zach said, "Is that significant?" Eli said, "She's never shown anyone the playlist." He looked back out the window. "Yeah," he said, somewhat wonderingly. "They really liked you." Late July brought a complication that arrived from an unexpected direction. Eli's research position had gone exceptionally well. So well that the supervising professor asked, midway through July, whether Eli would be interested in continuing the work as a formal research assistantship into the fall, with the possibility of co-authoring a chapter in the book. It was, by any measure, a remarkable opportunity for a third-year student. It was also something that would add significant hours to Eli's week during an already full semester, which meant less time for everything else, which Eli, being Eli, had already done the calculation on and was worried about before he even brought it up. He told Zach over dinner at the laundry center department, laying out the whole situation with the careful, ordered logic he used for things he'd thought about extensively. When he finished, Zach said, "Say yes," Eli said. It would mean less time for Zach said, "I know." "Say yes anyway." Eli looked at him. "You've been wanting this kind of thing since before I met you," Zach said. "This is the thing you've been working toward," Eli said. "I don't want to become someone who disappears into a project and forgets everything else." Zach said, "You're not going to do that." You literally just finished listing all the things you'd need to balance. You're already managing it in your head. Pause. Also, he added, I work at a bookstore and have Marco. I'll survive a few extra evenings a week. Eli was quiet. Then he said, You're very easy sometimes. You know that. Zach said, I know. Eli said, It's annoying. Zach said, I've been told. Eli looked at him for a long moment with the expression he had when Zach did something that made the careful architecture of his caution briefly unnecessary. Then he said, Okay. Then I'm going to say yes, Zach said. Good. Eli picked up his fork. Then he said, I'm telling them you encouraged me, so you're on record, Zach said. I accept full responsibility. Eli shook his head. He was fighting a smile. He lost August arrived and was warm and full and easy. Eli's research hours were long, but he was alive with the work in a way that was genuinely good to watch. He came home from the archive with his notebook full and his mind humming and sometimes started sentences mid-thought. Assuming Zach had been following his internal logic all day, Zach had in many cases, because Eli texted throughout the day, not often. Just at moments when a thought needed somewhere to land. An old letter with a particularly good turn of phrase. A discovery about a correspondent who turned out to have a whole second life nobody knew about. Once, a scan of a pressed flower that someone had kept between pages since 1891, which Eli sent with the message, someone kept this for over 100 years and nothing else, and which Zach stared at for a long time before replying. Worth keeping. On the last Sunday of August, they were in Eli's apartment, Eli reading. Zach lying on the couch in the opposite direction with his feet near Eli's shoulder, reading the book Eli had given him 2 months ago that he was embarrassingly behind on. The lamp was on. The window was open. The laundromat below was running. Eli finished a chapter and put the book down and looked at the ceiling. Zach, without looking up from his own page, said, Good chapter. Eli said, Really good chapter. A pause. She figures it out in this one, Zach said. About time, Eli said. She had to get there herself. You can't rush it. Zach turned to Paige. No, he said. You really can't. Eli looked at him. The lamp threw a warm light across his face, and the room was quiet, and August was ending, and everything ahead of them. It's the new semester. The research work, the things still unfinished between Zach and his father. The ordinary daily business of two people building a life that overlapped, was real and present, and theirs. Eli reached over and put his hand on Zach's ankle. Absently, the way you touch something you're certain of. Zach didn't look up from his page. He shifted his foot slightly, in acknowledgement. They stayed like that in the August evening, reading, as the summer wound down around them. New semester. 4th year. Everything slightly different in the specific way that final years are different, the sense of the ending visible in the distance. Not close yet, but real, casting its light forward onto everything else. Zach had declared his specialization, entrepreneurship, and communications. Eli was deep into his dissertation proposal alongside the research work, which meant he had more on his plate than any one person should reasonably attempt, and was managing it with the particular focused energy of someone who had long ago made peace with doing hard things. They saw each other less during the week, not by choice, just by math, and had developed, without planning it, the habit of a standing Thursday evening that was protected from scheduling in a way that both of them treated with a seriousness that would have been funny if it hadn't been entirely correct. Thursday evenings were simple. Sometimes dinner, sometimes takeout at one of the apartments. Sometimes just time, Eli working at the desk while Zach did something nearby. It's a particular comfort of occupying the same space. Once a month, Chris and his boyfriend, Devin, joined them for a long dinner that regularly ran until midnight and involved arguments about films and television, shows and books that everyone found genuinely energizing. Eli and Devin discovered a shared and very specific interest in pre-20th century correspondence that delighted Eli's research brain and convinced Devin that he should pivot careers, which his therapist apparently had opinions about. Chris watched Eli and Zach together across the table with the expression of someone who knew Zach's full history and was experiencing something between quiet joy and mild disbelief. After the second dinner, walking back from the restaurant, Chris put his arm around Zach and said, "You're so different," Zach said. "I'm exactly the same," Chris said. Zach said, "I know." He did know. He had known since April, since the hand on the path. October marked 1 year since the wrong classroom. Neither of them planned anything elaborate that wasn't their style, but Eli arrived at their Thursday evening with the specific worn paperback from the first day, which Zach had long assumed was permanently on Eli's shelf, and set it on the table between them. Zach picked it up. He opened it. Eli had highlighted one line, added one sticky note in the margin. The note said, "Still the best thing about the wrong classroom." Zach held the book for a moment. He looked at Eli. He said, "I was going to say something impressive," Eli said. "What happened?" Zach said, "I can't think of anything better than this," Eli said. "You don't have to." Zach put the book down. He reached across the table, and Eli met him halfway, and they sat there in the Thursday evening with 1 year behind them and everything ahead, and the kind of certainty that doesn't announce itself but just sits quietly in the room. They went to a late dinner after. Nothing fancy. The Thai place, their usual order, delivered to the table by a server who had seen them enough times to start bringing the tea before Eli asked. Eli talked about the Victorian woman and her 40 years of letters, which he kept returning to. And Zach talked about a pitch competition at the business school he was thinking about entering. And they split dessert and walked home, and nothing about it was remarkable, except that it was completely, entirely theirs. It kept being theirs. The hard weeks and the easy ones, the long thesis stretches and the bookstore shifts, the calls with Marco and the dinners with Chris and Devin, the video calls with Eli's family, where Elena was now treating Zach with a proprietary fondness that made Mina roll her eyes and Eli's parents smile. The ongoing, long, slow correspondence with his father, which was exactly that, ongoing, slow, imperfect. Sometimes 2 steps forward and 1 back, moving toward something that didn't have a name yet, but was undeniably moving. Zach had told Eli about that one evening, the full version, all 4 years of it, and Eli had listened the way he always listened, present, still, without trying to rearrange it into something tidier, and said, at the end, "You don't have to resolve it completely to make peace with it." Zach said, "Is that from a book?" Eli said, "No, it's from having a complicated family." He paused. "But there's probably a book," Zach said. "Of course there is." Eli said, "Do you want me to find it?" Zach said, "No, but thank you." Eli nodded. He handed him his coffee. They kept sitting together. Spring semester, final year, dissertations and thesis defenses, and the slow gathering weight of what came next. Eli's dissertation was on epistolary intimacy, the way people built closeness through written correspondence, cross distance and time, the specific language of letters as a form of presence. He showed Zach sections of it over the months of writing, not for editing, just because he wanted Zach to know what was in his head. Zach read all of it, more carefully than he read most things. He told Eli honestly what he thought, what worked, what he didn't follow, what affected him. Eli incorporated exactly none of the feedback and thanked him genuinely for all of it, which Zach found perfect. Eli defended in March. He was nervous the morning of, in a way, he'd been successfully hiding for a week and not quite successfully hiding for the last 12 hours. Zach woke up to a text at 6 a.m. that said simply, "Tell me something good." Zach thought about it for a moment. Then he wrote, "You've been thinking about this for 3 years. The committee hasn't. You're the only person in that room who already knows why this matters." A pause. Then Eli replied, "Okay, then thank you. Then go back to sleep." Zach did not go back to sleep. He lay there until 7 a.m. thinking about Eli, walking into that room and defending 3 years of thought about the way people stay close across distance. Eli passed with distinction. He texted Zach the result from outside the committee room. A single period. Zach replied, "Say the actual words." Eli replied, "Distinction." Zach replied, "Say the actual words." Eli replied, "I pass with distinction, and I'm going to go eat an entire meal by myself and then sleep for 16 hours. Zach was already at the cafe table when Eli arrived 20 minutes later. He had ordered Eli's tea and had, for reasons he could not fully explain, brought a single yellow sticky note. He pushed it across the table when Eli sat down. It said, "Worth keeping." Eli looked at it. He was very quiet for a moment. Then he picked it up and put it in his jacket pocket. Then he sat back and drank his tea, and Zach let him be quiet because that was what the moment called for. Quiet. And together, in warm April again, final spring on campus. The path with the trees, going green again, as they had a year ago. As they had for however many years before that, and would for however many years after. Eli and Zach were walking it on a Thursday afternoon when Eli, who had been thinking about something and working up to saying it in the particular way he had, said, "I've been offered a place on a graduate program." Zach said, "Which one?" Eli told him. It was a good program, a very good program, one he'd applied to in the fall because his research supervisor had pushed him to. It was also in another city. Zach said, "When?" Eli said, "September." He paused. "I wanted to tell you and then figure out what comes next together." Zach looked at the path ahead. He thought about this. He thought about September in another city and distance. He thought about everything that had already been figured out, together, over the last year and a half. He said, "Tell me about the program." So Eli told him, "They're on the path in the April sun. All of it, the focus of the work, the faculty, what it would mean for the research he wanted to do, the shape of the next 2 years." Zach listened. When Eli finished, Zach said, "You should go." Eli said, "I need to know what you." Zach said, "Eli, you should go. We're going to figure out the rest." Eli was quiet. "Distance is a thing that exists," Zach said. "People have been figuring it out for a long time. You literally wrote a dissertation about it." Eli made a sound that was half laugh, half breath. "That was correspondence in the 19th century," Zach said. "Same principle. People build closeness across distance." "You told me that?" Eli said, You read my dissertation, Zach said. I read every word of your dissertation. Eli looked at him. The trees were green along the path. The campus was full of the particular noise of the last spring of something good. Eli said, "This is terrifying." Zach said, "I know." He took Eli's hand. "I'm still here, though." Eli looked at their hands. He looked at Zach. "Yeah," he said. "You are." They kept walking. Graduation. Both of them. The same week in June, Eli's ceremony on Thursday, Zach's on Saturday. 2 sets of photographs and 2 sets of family in the city at overlapping times, which meant that on Friday evening there was a dinner that Zach had not planned and somehow was primarily responsible for hosting, featuring Eli's family, Marco, Chris, Devin, and Zach's own small collection of people, in the Thai restaurant that knew their order, where Alina talked to Marco with a focused intensity that Marco later described as one of the most interesting conversations he'd had in years, where Mina showed Devin her playlist in a moment of spontaneous trust, where Eli's father and Zach had, for the first time, a real conversation, not careful, not circling, but direct, about work and plans in the future, and at the end of which Eli's father said, "My son is very fortunate," and Zach said, "Simply and truly, so am I." Watching from the other end of the table caught Zach's eye and held it for a moment, where everything that had been built over the last 2 years was present and visible in the room. Not as a monument, just as what it was, something real, made of ordinary material, requiring daily attention, entirely worth it. That night, late, they were on Eli's rooftop in the building where he'd spent the year. The city below them, summer in the air. Eli was sitting on the low wall, the skyline behind him. His graduation hood draped over his shoulder where he'd forgotten to take it off. Zach was next to him with a takeout container of things from the restaurant they'd saved at the end of the evening. They didn't say very much. They had said a lot already over the course of 2 days and 2 ceremonies and 1 unexpected group dinner. There was a comfortable completeness to the quiet. Eli said, "Eventually, I keep thinking about what happens next." Zach said, "What do you think?" Eli said, "I think it's unknown." He paused. "That used to make me more nervous than it does," Zach said. "What changed?" Eli said, "I know what I'm bringing with me." He looked at Zach. "That part is an unknown." Zach was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "When do you leave in September?" Eli said, "The 15th. Zach said, "I'm coming to help you move." Eli said, "It's a 6-hour drive." Zach said, "I know." He looked out at the city. "I'll bring the sports posters. We can start a collection." Eli said, "You're not putting the sports posters in my apartment," Zach said. "1. Just 1. "For morale?" Eli said. "Absolutely not," Zach said. "The small one. The one Marco doesn't like." Eli said. "Which one is that?" Zach said. "I'll bring it, and you'll see it, and you'll love it." Eli was quiet for 3 seconds. Then he said 1. Zach said, "Deal." Eli shook his head. He looked at the city. After a moment, without looking over, he said, "I love you," Zach said. "I love you too." Simple, easy. There's the city sat below them, indifferent and full of life, doing what cities do. And the 2 of them sat on the rooftop wall in the June night with everything ahead of them. Unresolved and possible and real. Eli leaned his head against Zach's shoulder. Zach leaned back. The graduation hood slipped off onto the wall, and neither of them moved to catch it. Below, the city was bright. Above, the stars were doing their best against the light. Neither of them spoke for a long time, and it was completely fine. And it was the kind of quiet that requires years to build, and they had done exactly that. and neither of them took it for granted even for a second. Worth keeping. Both of them, the whole thing, worth every bit.